بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله النبي الكريم. We continue on with our fiqh classes, alhamdulillah. We had one chapter left for zakat, and that was the chapter of Sadaqatul Fitr. And then inshallah, from next week onwards, we will begin Sawm, the chapter of fasting. And it's a good time actually, because Ramadan is less than 100 days away, right? About 100 days, more or less, or maybe 3 months now. But while I was in Medina, it was 100 days. So now it should be maybe like 85 days or so long. But anyways, alhamdulillah, it's a good segue and inshallah a good opportunity for us to study the chapter of Sadaqatul Fitr, because that'll also be coming up inshallah. And then of course the fiqh of fasting as well, inshallah, that'll be coming up. And very important, because the fact is that many of us, all of these topics, many of us, we think we know, and then the realization comes in that there's a lot that we don't actually know, right? And even if you do know it, it's still a great refresher, and it's important to study just for the sake of actually learning. And even if you don't implement it, there are many ahadith, and I won't go into it, but there are many ahadith which discuss the virtues of acquiring knowledge, even if you will not implement that knowledge. So even if you don't practice on that knowledge, just acquiring that knowledge is also extremely beneficial and will be a source of khair, inshallah, in the akhirah for you, inshallah. So that being said, inshallah, today we'll talk about Sadaqatul Fitr. It's not lengthy, it's relatively short, so we'll go through it. We'll start off regarding Sadaqatul Fitr. He mentions Sadaqatul Fitri wajibatun ala al-hurri al-muslim إذا كان مالكا لمقدار النصاب فاضلا عن مسكنه وثيابه وأثاثه وفرسه وسلاحه وعبيده للخدمة. So there's essentially 5 topics in this chapter. And so the first is regarding what's the Shari'i definition, or what's the characteristics of the Sadaqatul Fitr. So he said that it's wajib. Wajib meaning it's between fard and sunnah, or essentially that according to us, as I've mentioned, as I've clarified before, that according to the Hanafi scholars, we have many different classifications, right? So you start from fard, and within fard you have a fard ayn, you have fard kifaya, and so on and so forth. You have different types of fard, meaning, and then you have wajib, which is a bit less than fard. And essentially wajib are those things which are meaning there's a difference of opinion, essentially, right? And then you have sunnah, and sunnah is also classified as sunnah, which is something the Prophet ﷺ would regularly do. And then there are those sunnah that the Prophet ﷺ would occasionally do. Okay, so then you have the classifications of after sunnah, you have mustahab, you have mandub, you have nafil, and so on and so forth. So it seems complicated. It seems that there are many different, or there are too many classifications. Whereas according to other scholars, for example, to my knowledge, the Shafi'is and others, they just have either fard or nafil. That's it. It's either fard or nafil, right? So it seems easier, right? But in reality, it depends, right? So for example, if it's only fard or nafil, then there may be more things that are necessary. Whereas according to us, it's not really fard, it may be wajib, or it may be sunnah mu'akkada, for example, right? But according to them, it's fard, so it's just fard or nafil. But so although it may seem more complicated, but generally it's a bit easier for us, inshallah. So he says that sadaqah is a very broad word. So sadaqah can be referred to anything that's charity, right? So it can be optional charity or necessary charity. So for example, you have the regular sadaqah, you have which is obviously optional. Then you have Sadaqatul Fitr, which is wajib. Then you have the fard sadaqah, which is known as zakat, right? Which we are completing now. He mentions that this is actually based on the hadith Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, he quotes, he says, فرض رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم زكاة الفطر استهرة للصائم من اللغو والرفث. That Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu mentions that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam obligated Zakatul Fitr. So sometimes it's called Zakatul Fitr, sometimes it's called Sadaqatul Fitr. Both are the same. It says this was legislated as a means of cleansing the fasting person from all of the useless and all of the impure things that they did in their fast, right? وَطُعْمَةً لِلْمَسَاكِينَ. And the second reasoning is as a source of food for the, or a source of, whether you can say like consumption or food, whatever it is, for the masakin, for the poor. Man addaha qabla salati fahiya zakatun maqbula. Those who give it before the salah, meaning the salatul Eid, then this is an accepted charity. ومن أداها بعد الصلاة فهي صدقة من الصدقات. And those who give it after the Eid salah, then it's just another type of charity. We'll talk about it. We'll talk about when a person must give it, but let's go through it. So the first thing is that it's wajib. And now who is it wajib on? We'll talk about the 4 conditions. The first is hur, they must be a free person. The second is they must be a Muslim. إذا كان مالكا لمقدار النصاب. When they have the nisab amount. We discussed the nisab amount, right? You guys remember? We talked about it a few weeks ago, maybe. What's the nisab amount? First of all, which standard do we use? Come on, guys. The gold standard. Okay, yes. We use the gold standard. Now, what's the gold standard? Huh? No. Sorry? 87.48. 87.48 grams of gold. That's the equivalency, or the equivalency of that in cash. That's the nisab. That's the standard of wealth, according to us, right? So 87.48 grams of gold. So as I mentioned before, it's probably around like $7,000-ish, right? So basically, if you have $7,000-ish, I say ish because it's fluctuating, right? It's constantly fluctuating. So today, if you check it, maybe it's more, gold is, I don't know how it's doing now. But it's constantly fluctuating. So around $7,000, right? If you have that much money, then you must give Sadaqatul Fitr. Now, okay, we'll talk about it. The 4th condition, فَاضِلًا عَنْ مَسْكَنِهِ. It must be excess, meaning that money must be excess from his housing, his clothes, and his furniture, his animal, his weapons, and his servants. Right? So meaning it must be beyond his basic necessities, right? So that $7,000 must be in either cash, gold, or silver. And it must be excess of whatever he, so obviously we talked about debts previously, we spoke about all of those other things. Essentially that 7,000 needs to be excess money, right? So those are the 4 conditions, right? Any questions so far? Okay, moving on, right? So he says the 3rd topic, right? يخرج ذلك عن نفسه وعن أولاده الصغار وعبيده للخدمة. Right? So he says that, actually, there's a question that you guys should have had, right? Which is that we mentioned that you must have nisab amount, but is it a requirement to pass a year or not? So for example, in zakat, as we discussed previously, for zakat, the requirement is that a year must pass. So for example, if you have $7,000, this is the first time you ever got 7,000, for example, right? Beyond 7, let's say $8,000. Let's say you had 5,000, for example, you got your paycheck, and now that exceeded 7,000, for example, right? In that case, do you have to give zakat that exact day? No. You give zakat next year on that exact day, right? So you have to wait a year, basically, to give zakat on that amount. And every year you would calculate on that day, right? But for Sadaqatul Fitr, you don't have to wait a year. So if Sadaqatul Fitr is necessary on you, let's say, for example, Ramadan 1, that's when you reach beyond nisab amount. And so when Eid comes along and Sadaqatul Fitr becomes necessary, then you have to give it, even though a year did not pass on that money. Does that make sense? Okay, right? So that was a question that you should have had. You didn't have, so I'll explain it for you, inshallah. All right. And now, who do you give it on behalf of? You must give it on behalf of yourself, and you must give it on behalf of your young minor children, right? And your servants, which you don't have, right? So, but basically yourself and your minor children. So we said it before, right? On every Muslim. So whether old or young, every single Muslim, according to our scholars, must give Sadaqatul Fitr. So whether you're an adult or a child, you must give it. If you're a child, your guardians will give it on your behalf. And if you're an adult, you must give it on your behalf. Okay? So, وَلَا يُؤَدِّي عَنْ زَوْجَتِي. You're not required to give it on behalf of your wife. وَلَا عَنْ أَوْلَادِهِ الْكِبَارِ وَإِنْ كَانُوا فِي عِيَالِهِ. Also, you're not required to give it on behalf of your older children, right? You're not required to give it on behalf of your older children, even if they live with you. Even if they live with you, you're not required to give it. وَلَا يُخْرِجُ عَنْ مُكَاتَبِهِ وَلَا عَنْ مَمَالِكِ لِلتِّجَارَةِ. You don't give it on behalf of your slaves and servants. Okay? So you must give it on behalf of yourself and your minor children. When I say minor, what does that mean? Under 18?
Yes.
No.
Even 1 month or 12. Under 8?
Kind of close. No, but under what? What's the standard? Baligh, bulugh. Bulugh is what determines whether a person is a minor or an adult in Islam, right? So if a person is baligh, then they're an adult. If they're not baligh, then they're a minor, right? So basically, as we mentioned, for boys, it's between the ages of 12 and 15. So they can become baligh at any point between 12 and 15. Now, 12 and 15, is that solar years or lunar years? Lunar years, right? So meaning, if you do, I've done the calculations multiple times before. I'm not going to do it again, but essentially about 11 years and like 7 months solar years till about like what is it, or something, whatever the calculation is. Essentially 12 to 15 Islamic months, and 11 something you have the solar months. And for girls, it's between the ages of 9 and 15, right? So meaning automatically once they hit 15, they're now automatically baligh. Okay, 15 lunar months. Okay, what else do we talk about? Okay, so you must give it on behalf of yourself and your minor children. You're not required to give it on behalf of your wife, right? So meaning, if a person does give it, what happens? Then obviously it's done. If you give it on behalf of your wife and your older kids, that's okay. That's okay. You don't even need their permission. You can give it on their behalf, and you can tell them that I gave it on your behalf. Okay, so that suffices. There's a question that what if she doesn't work, right? And she's dependent on you. It doesn't matter. Even if she doesn't work, and she has her own money, some brothers are happy, mashallah, right? But it's still her responsibility. It's her responsibility. Now, if you give it, that's good and well. If you say, I will not give it, then you're not required to give it, right? Same thing with zakat, right? You don't have to give, and generally zakat is obviously a lot more, right? But Sadaqatul Fitr is generally a smaller amount. So generally, the fathers, the husbands, they give it generally, right? But you're not required to do so. Okay, that makes sense? Basically, if you give it, good and well. If you don't give it, then I mean, at the end of the day, it's her responsibility. Each person is responsible for their own Sadaqatul Fitr. So my mashwara is that you should tell your wife that I'm giving it on your behalf, right? And you should also tell your kids that I'm giving your Sadaqatul Fitr on your behalf as well. Make sure that they know, right? Because if they don't know, then, you know, when the time comes later on, they won't know what's happening, what they're supposed to do, and so on, right? They should know that this is an obligation. I must do it. And even though my father is doing it on my behalf, it is still a responsibility. Right?
I have a question regarding the jewelry, gold. That, for example, my wife is not working, but she had the jewelry, she's using it.
Yeah.
So I'm responsible for the zakat, right?
No,
brother,
that's her gold.
But she's not working.
So I spoke about this before, but basically, if a person, and this is common, right? Many women, for example, they have a lot of gold. And the same question came out. Normally, gold is under woman possession and owned. They are required to pay as long as sahib nisab. I don't know who's saying that to who, but anyways, so if a woman has gold, but she has no other cash, for example, right? In that case, it's still her responsibility. Technically, it's her responsibility, right? Let's say she has $10,000 worth of gold, for example, right? She has no cash, she has nothing else, right? In that case, it is still her responsibility to give zakat. It's her gold, it's her responsibility, right? But if the husband says, you know what, from my goodwill, I'm a good husband, so I will give, your zakat, that's
okay.
That's good, mashallah. It's a good husband, and wife should say thank you, and she should be appreciative of this, of course, mashallah, She should do things, for for that wife, for the husband. But essentially, it's not his responsibility. It's her responsibility. Each person is their own individual, right? So that's her responsibility. Then if you give it, so then what if the husband says no? What if the husband says no, right? If the husband says no, then she must either sell some of her gold or, I don't know, find some money or work or whatever else it is, but it's her responsibility to discharge that zakat. Okay. Any other questions? All right. ويؤدي المسلم الفطرة عن عبد. Okay, that's actually about that doesn't apply to us. Okay. والفطرة, now we're going to talk about what is صدقة, how much do you need to give. والفطرة نصف صاع من بر أو صاع من تمر أو زبيب أو شعير. So essentially the way to calculate Sadaqatul Fitr is four standards. Four standards, right? Number one is okay, we'll talk about saw, right? Essentially just remember this measurement, right? Half a saw, right? So half a saw is about 1.6 kg. 1.6 kg, which is equivalent to about 3.5 pounds. It's 3.5 pounds, essentially, more or less, right? 3.5 pounds of wheat, right? Or 7 pounds of dates, or 7 pounds of raisins, or 7 pounds of barley. These are the four standards. Again, 3.5 pounds of wheat, 7 pounds of dates, 7 pounds of raisins, or 7 pounds of barley. These are the four standards. Now, obviously, none of us use those things, right? We don't deal in barley, wheat, dates, or raisins, right? So what you should do is discharge the cash equivalency, right? The cash equivalency based on, and again, they fluctuate generally, right? And so generally, most of us, we don't really deal with it. Generally, what happens is like one of the Sharia boards, they do their calculations and they just tell us that it's this amount, and so you should distribute this amount, right? Now, I want to address some things here, right? There are some people some masajid, for example, they mandate, they say, you know what? The required amount is $10, for example. Now, where is that $10 coming from? They have no standard. They're just saying $10, right? And I've said this before as well, right? Some people, they say $15, $15, right? No. If you're saying that this is the amount, it has to be based on one of these four amounts. You cannot just say, so for example, if a person must give $100 of zakat, right? But they choose to give $200, that's fine. That's good. $100 is mandatory, $100 extra. But you cannot say that you must give $200, even though they're required to pay $100, right? You can't mandate something that's not required. So same thing here, right? You cannot mandate something that's not required. So you cannot say $15, $15, $20, $20. No. Where are you getting this number from? Many masajid, they do this. They just say standard X amount. So you cannot do that. Rather, it must be equivalent to one of these numbers. Now, yes, we encourage you to give the higher amount. Generally, dates is the higher amount, right? So if you calculate like 7 pounds of dates, that'll probably be some amount of money, right? But the cheapest is wheat, obviously. So generally, the number is about maybe $7, more or less about $7. $7 or $8 is the bare minimum. That's the standard, the minimum amount. Now, should you give $7? No, you should give a little more, right? Because generally the idea is that you're able to give something, as I mentioned, to the masakeen so that they can enjoy the day of Eid. That's the objective, right? And also as a means of cleansing, whatever mistakes you made in the fasts. So therefore, you should give a bit more. You should not just give $7. If you have the financial capability, give more. Give $10, give $15, give $20. As I said, dates maybe like 40 something dollars, $50, for example. Give it, right? If you're giving for example, you, your wife, and a couple kids, mashallah, maybe it's like a couple $100 at maximum. At maximum, it's only a couple of $100, right? But imagine you give $300 to a family who's going to enjoy Eid with that money. Right? Imagine they didn't have money previously, but they're using that money to enjoy their Eid. So that's a very important thing, right? As opposed to, for example, if you do 7 times, let's say you have 3 kids, for example. Let's say you give, so it's 5 of you, your wife, and 3 kids, for example. 5 times 7 is 35. So you give $35. $35, I mean, most people can't do much with it. Even if you were to convert it to taka or rupees or something, it still would not be that much money, right? So therefore, if you have the ability, give a bit more. That's my recommendation, right? But at the end of the day, the bare minimum is that amount that we generally tell you, that the minimum is $7 or $8, for example. But if you can, you should definitely give more. Is that clear to everybody? But those masajid, those people that just say, oh, give $10 or give $20, that's not right. It has to be based on one of these 4 standards. Questions? Okay. Yeah.
Established the conditions for the that why it is due on minors also.
So, good question, right? So the Sadaqatul Fitr, when it comes to the minors, you're not looking at the minor's wealth, you're looking at the father's wealth, right? So the father must give it on behalf of his minor children, right? So therefore, you're not considering the minor's wealth, you're considering the father's nisab, okay? So for adults, yes. So for example, let's say you have a 16-year-old son or daughter, for example, right? And they don't have $7,000 in extra money, for example, right? In that case, they may not be required to give it, right? But what many parents they do is they just give it, because it's not generally not a lot of money. Even if you were to take the higher standard, maybe like $40, $50, so it's not really a lot of money. So in that case, many parents they just give it anyways, right? So even if the child is not necessary, even if it's not necessary for him to give it, they still generally give it, right? But so for kids, for minors, you would look at the father. If the father has nisab amount, then yes, you would have to give it on behalf of the kids as well.
What if the father is not like passed away? The mother is the one that's
Then you look at the mother's wealth. If the mother has the responsibility, if she's wealthy, then she must give it.
If she's not wealthy.
If she's not wealthy, then she doesn't have to give it. If she doesn't have to give it, then the kids don't have to give it.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, now we're going to talk about the timing. When is it necessary? When is that timing? Right. The 5th and last topic. وجوب الفطرة يتعلق بطلوع الفجر الثاني من يوم الفطر فمن مات قبل ذلك لم تجب فطرته ومن أسلم أو ولد بعد طلوع الفجر لم تجب فطرته. Okay. The timing is essentially from the time of Fajr on the day of Eid. On the day of Eid, from after the Fajr Salah of when the Fajr time begins, that's when the obligation begins. So essentially, then he says, so if someone dies before that time, then Sadaqatul Fitr is not wajib. Or if someone accepts Islam, right, after Tulu al-Fajr, after the time of Fajr begins, then they don't have to give it. Or someone is born after Fajr begins, then they don't have to give Sadaqatul Fitr, right? So essentially the timing, the obligatory timing is after Fajr begins, right? That's just the obligatory timing, just to determine if that's the time that a person must give it or not, after Fajr. والمستحب أن يخرج الناس الفطرة يوم الفطر قبل الخروج إلى المصلى. But the recommended time is that the people they give their fitrah on the day of Fitr before going to the musalla. So it's necessary on the day of Fitr, right, after Fajr. But ideally you should, again, according to this book, he's saying that ideally you should give it before going to the musalla. فإن قدموها, okay. فإن قدموها قبل يوم الفطر جازا. If you give it prior to the day of Fitr, that's permissible. وإن أخروها عن يوم الفطر لم تسقط وكان عليهم إخراجها. Now, if you give it after the day of Fitr has passed, meaning the obligation does not drop off, and they still must give it, right? So what does this mean? And that's essentially the entire discussion. That what does this mean? This means that if someone is able to, they should definitely give it before, well in advance. Now, why does he mention it, give it before going to the musalla? Because generally, in those communities, what happens is there are, many less fortunate people. And so you can easily find somebody and you can easily give them money before going to the musalla, right? But in our society, generally, it's difficult to find people who are eligible for zakat. And I've mentioned this before. And this also opens the discussion for who is the recipient. The same recipients as zakat. Same recipients who receive zakat, these will be the same people who receive Sadaqatul Fitr. So that means, as I've said many times before, that it's difficult to find zakat eligible people in America. I've said this many times before. Not impossible, but difficult, right? Difficult to find zakat eligible people in America, right? And so therefore, as I've said before as well, if you are able to give to the people who need it the most, right? And so oftentimes many people, what they do is they just give it back home, their own respective countries. And I believe that's the best option. I always say this is the best option, that you give it to, with your own hand, you give it to whoever you know is the most deserving, right? Most people, they want to give to the masjid, but the masjid cannot use it. So what does the masjid do? The masjid also gives it away as well. So the same thing, either you give it yourself or the masjid gives it on your behalf, but the masjid cannot use it for themselves. So therefore, there's no real benefit in giving it to the masjid. You understand? There's no real benefit, right? Rather, the masjid is taking on another responsibility. The masjid is taking on a responsibility to distribute it to the recipients. But the best is for the people to distribute on their own, and give it on their own. Just as zakat, same thing, right? The masjid cannot use zakat, right? But generally, why do you give to the masjid zakat? Because oftentimes poor people or less fortunate people, they come to the masjid and they ask the masjid for zakat or for money, for help and assistance, and generally the masjid uses those funds and they discharge it. But as I've said many times before, that if you give it with your own hands, that's better, right? So for example, let's say Ramadan begins and you know some families in Bangladesh and Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, whichever country you're from, and you go and you contact through your relatives or whoever it is, and you give them that money well in advance, weeks in advance before Eid. That way they can use that money for Eid and they can enjoy Eid when Eid does come around, right? So that's my recommendation, that you should give it weeks in advance, and you should give it ideally with your own hands. And you don't need to go through any masjid. You can give it by your own hands, inshallah, to the recipients. And that's the better option generally, right? Sadaqah, yes, of course, you should help the masjid. But zakat, I would say it's better to give with your own hand to the recipients, right? Any questions? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question about Islam, and you might have seen this discussed very often. We're talking about 87 grams of dollars, grams of $7.5 sonar, and then 52.5 something silver. But if you look at the price is too much different. So as you mentioned, gold could be like $7,000 around today.
Yeah.
And then 52.5 silver maybe like $700 or $800. So there is like too much difference in the nasab. And then I was in a gathering where somebody mentioned that these were established to judge who is poor and who is like rich. And his point was that it's not like a standard to but that time it was like standard to judge the poor and rich, but it may not be valid standard. So we have to see in a region, like what is the standard and the poverty level, what is the between the rich or between the poor, what is the level that is identified. So he was like, for US, he was saying like US something like 24,000 income or something. I know Islam goes by that, what you have the money, right, not what your income is. So he was saying that one has to establish like what is the poverty level in a country, and according to that, the person could be considered as a rich or poor.
So respectfully, I completely disagree with this person, right? Why? Because look, there are certain things that we use our logic for, and that makes sense. In dunyawi things, yeah, use your logic, yeah, poverty level, blah, 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 use your logic there. But in ukhrawi things, we don't use logic, right? So you don't go according to what the US standard of poverty line is and so on and so forth, right? At the time, the Prophet ﷺ, he said that this amount of gold, this amount of silver, right? And yes, they used mithqal and so on. They used obviously the terms that were available then. Nowadays, we don't use those terms, so we use grams, right? And so it's 87.48 grams of gold, which was 20 mithqals at the time, and 20 dinar, 20 gold coins, and it was 200 silver coins, which is equivalent to actually 612 grams of silver, right? And yes, at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they were the same. So 612 grams of silver was the same as 87.48 grams of gold. They were the same amount. Now, over the past 1400 years, gold kept going up and silver kept going down. So now silver, 612 grams of silver are probably worth $700, probably. And for 87.48 grams of gold is worth more than $7,000. So it's more than 10 times the value, right? But still, that doesn't mean that we change our standards. We still must stick to what the Prophet ﷺ said. And these types of things, we don't use logic. In these types of like, masail, these types of like standards, we don't use our logic because this is what the Prophet ﷺ said. When the Prophet ﷺ gave us an exact number, we stick to that number. We don't think, okay, you know what, my logic, this, that. No. We stick to whatever the Prophet ﷺ said. So some people, they try to use their intelligence and they think that they, okay, you know what, I'll use my logic for this and that. No, and these types of scenarios, when it comes to the Prophet ﷺ and specific things, specific numbers that the Prophet ﷺ gave, we accept whatever the Prophet ﷺ gave, and we don't change based on our circumstances or anything else. And that opens a whole can of worms, which you don't want to do, which questioning the Prophet ﷺ and whatever is best or what's better. And the Prophet ﷺ, he was Shari', meaning he was the one who was legislating Sharia. And so when he said something, when he gives us a number, that's the number. That's the bottom line. Yes, now there's a difference of opinion. Should you take the silver standard or the gold standard? Yes, the difference is there. The ikhtilaf is there. But according to ours, the standard of wealth, if someone has $700, they're not considered wealthy by any means, right? If you have $700, do you call yourself rich or poor? No, you call yourself technically poor, right? But if someone has $7,000 of extra wealth, then yeah, that's a good amount of money. Even according to American standards, even according to America, it's like it's a good amount of money. If you have like $7,000 in the bank account, extra money after deducting all debts, it's a good amount. You're not Bill Gates, but you have a decent amount of money, alhamdulillah, So that's the idea, that the nisab, whatever the Prophet ﷺ said, that is the nisab, right? The amount fluctuates, but that number, 87.48 grams of gold, that does not fluctuate. So whatever the value of that amount is, that's the number that we accept.
Except the obligation starts at Fitr. That means the nisab also may have the nisab the day before. At the Fitr time, you don't have the nisab, you don't pay.
Exactly, right? So yes, the question is that, let's say you have the nisab amount the day before, right? So let's say Ramadan, okay, let's just keep it simple. The day before you have nisab, on the day of you don't have nisab, you don't have to give Sadaqatul Fitr. You're not required to. If you still want to, you can, but you're not required to. Right. Any other questions before we end off? Okay. All right, so that concludes today, inshallah, and that'll be regarding Sadaqatul Fitr. Inshallah, next week we'll be starting fasting, inshallah. And also next week I have a program, I have an event after Aisha. So next Sunday, same Sunday. So just for next Sunday, and I'll send a message. I will send a message, inshallah, but specifically only for next Sunday, we will have this class after Maghrib, inshallah, only for next Sunday. So I will send a message, inshallah, but only next Sunday we will have this class after Maghrib instead of after Isha because of some event that I must attend. But generally, as always, we will keep it after Maghrib, after Isha, inshallah. Specifically for next week, we'll keep it after Maghrib. If you have any further questions, you can always ask me separately, inshallah. And with that, we conclude.